Welcome to the Cinema Cartography.
This video is sponsored by Mubi. Mubi is a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from around the globe. For your extended free trial, go to mubi.com/cinemacartography. On June 1st, 1967, the Beatles released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The album cover features the members of the band in front of an array of historical and popular cultural figures. From Sonny Liston, Marlene Dietrich, Karl Marx, Oscar Wilde and Marlon Brando, this image became a landmark as one of the first instances in mainstream culture of a musician acknowledging the post-modernity of their own image. It acted as a signifier of the artist's status as an icon within the social milieu. The band stands in front in their bright colours, while all those behind them exist in black and white. As well as showing their direct influences, this image more than anything explores the social ambience in which someone lives within pop culture before becoming pop culture themselves. In this image, the Beatles take from some intentionally and from others unintentionally, as some figures define their epoch so much they become entwined with its existence, just as the Beatles had become. As artists, their journey took them to a point where they must reform something from their past, making it new, attaining a new level of iconic status, where their very existence will be that of inescapable influence, even making their previous symbols as artists look like caricatures of themselves. And understanding this idea is fundamental to understanding the cinema of Quentin Tarantino. The story of art is exactly that, a story. It has its lead characters and supporting characters. It has its most memorable moments and progresses through a means of cause and effect. For most artists, it's hard to admit our influences, especially when we often spend so much time trying to avoid imitating their work. However, like it or not, art is built off of those that came before us. But where's the line between inspiration and imitation? What's the difference between reference, homage, imitation and parody when it comes to film? All manner of tribute comes with some manner of self-awareness through your own comparison against a previously existing piece of art. But it's the degree of self-awareness and internal referencing that would inevitably bring us to the concept of postmodernism. The idea of postmodernity is a rejection of a grand narrative, that truth is based around subjectivity, and so anything can be truth. But just talking about this in the realm of art, we can interpret this as a means to co-opt cultural landmarks and insert yourself into those narratives, creating a new truth, or perhaps forcing our existences into one shared event. In cinema, this idea of utilising popular culture has been done many times. In Godard's films, for instance, we see our main characters attending cinemas, reading works by Poe, and reciting quotations from philosophers. However, Godard came from the school of the Nouvelle Vague, and so his perspective was of auteur theory, not of postmodernism. Postmodernism rejects high art, something intrinsic to the nature of the auteur. Auteurship holds true the ideal of individual perspective in cinema that builds upon the established notions of the classic to morph something new. Auteurs aim to create high art. The reason why I cannot class Godard as a postmodern director is because although much of his work was based around cultural references, the majority of those references are high art.
Vous m'aviez promis la Chine, le Tibet, Monsieur Sosten, les îles de la Sonde, les plantes merveilleuses et magiques.
Scorsese also resides under the umbrella of the cinematic auteur, as well as a filmmaker known for his awareness and knowledge of cinema. Yet his references were more mainstream culture, recontextualized through the lens of underclasses and fringe communities. When Scorsese uses songs of the era or historical figures, he's taking an imprint of that culture and time, an outline of the knowledge and reference that we know, and uses it to recontextualize events in the film. Rather than us acknowledging those forms of art as creating the society they were in, Scorsese shows that a mutual truth is that it was these often violent societies that these icons emerged from. This is something that we don't tend to follow in history, and this new perspective forms a new narrative thread within culture. But Tarantino's references are something else entire. Tarantino's point of reference is in itself a difficult thing to categorize, as it goes beyond the notion of reference, as sometimes it's direct usage. It's something that we've not seen in cinema prior to this, although we have seen it in art before. Paul's Boutique was released by the Beastie Boys in 1989 and may go down as the most densely sampled album of all time, taking pieces from Public Enemy to Bernard Herrmann, creating a sonically layered masterpiece. Over $250,000 was spent on just getting the clearances for the samples, and according to Beastie Boys sound engineer Mario Caldato Jr., 95% of the record was sampled. In making Paul's Boutique, the Beastie Boys took the melting pot that they grew up in, sampling movies, punk rock, and classic hip-hop, using the work that others had created to create a sound that was quintessentially them. In this method, the Beastie Boys were able to stitch together fragments of a society in a way that had not been seen before, weaving a tapestry of multiple truths, creating a new branch of knowledge. People looked at these pieces individually, and they may have even looked at them in context to one another. However, the Beastie Boys offered something unique, a true fusion, showing that Pink Floyd and Curtis Blow could belong in the same frame as reference as they did for the Beastie Boys growing up, and now would for so many more to come. This merging offered a new perspective of the pre-existing knowledge that we attained, and Tarantino applies something very akin to a Paul's Boutique to the nature of filmmaking, candidly taking elements of popular culture and weaving them together. But what is it that differentiates his method to a Godard or a Scorsese? Godard and Scorsese fall neatly into the category of the cinematic auteur, establishing themselves within the hierarchy of art, even if unintentionally. Godard's reference points were always of high art, and Scorsese's references were too far removed from pastiche, rather genuine homages for his love of the form through lenses of people that were interchangeable within their cultures. Tarantino's lens is not this. Tarantino's cinema is copious in regards to its referencing, many coming from his love of classic cinema, however the majority of it coming from the fringes of the form, which possibly explains why people don't claim his work as pastiche, because they aren't aware of the origin of its existence. Much of Tarantino's work is a direct imitation of pieces that many people wouldn't recognise, as his referencing isn't that of a mainstream culture. Because of this, Tarantino is what we may call a postmodern auteur, for even though both of these terms contradict themselves, they can also work in tandem to one another. When we think of the stylistic nature of a Tarantino film, certain ideas are conjured, a hyper-violence in a world wherein subcultures reign supreme. But what exactly is it that makes something Tarantino-esque stylistically? Well, we know that it's a take on 1960s and 1970s cliches of the time, but a very personal one. This very specific past is a truth to Tarantino, but not as much for others. His reference is the other. It's a form of knowledge that most are familiar with precisely because it was on the fringe, because not many people of the time went to watch grindhouse films, or anything related to the culture. This is an image of the world that lay on the outskirts for most. When people think of the 1970s, they wouldn't directly think of the exploitation forms of cinema, the B and C tiers of culture, because they didn't experience it, and as a result, it isn't what lasts. It doesn't become part of the history of art. History is nothing more than knowledge, and knowledge must be passed on. The fringes form a layer of knowledge where specificity isn't necessary, it's just a silhouette of the culture.
Oh, so you must be the infamous butterfly.
However, this knowledge was the knowledge that was true to Tarantino. Films like Zatoichi and Kiss Me Deadly were Tarantino's mainstream. They were what formed his culture. And so the taking of one moment from Coffee, or any number of exploitation flicks as narrative fodder for his stories, is exactly the same as the Beastie Boys taking influence from the array of sound that was around to make something no one else could. Because like Tarantino, this was an experience totally unique to them. People can recognise the parts and appreciate the entirety, but never the other way around. Tarantino's reference is not akin to any other epoch, it's completely his own. And now it may seem as though these subcultures he was referencing have been retroactively co-opted into the culture of the past, thanks to his work. Postmodernism is attributed to the philosophical aspect of taking an idea and within that, being able to capture the past, the present, and the future all at once. And elements of this are very evident in the work of Tarantino. First, there is the capturing of the past, the very obvious usage of taking pieces from cinematic history and altering it in one way or another. But the recontextualization is exactly what captures the idea of the present, the insertion of an archaic ideal into our own times. You can even argue that simply by using the past directly is altering to the original piece in itself through new layers of context. And the future is the most complex idea, and with this, we need to look at Tarantino's career on a much broader scale. Tarantino's aim is to recontextualize our present knowledge with the past. He takes obscure pop culture and recontextualizes it into the norm through mainstream iconography. Characters that are visually identifiable by their costumes, music so non-diegetic yet synced up to the events on screen. To the point that the films become icons in themselves, becoming their own kind of mainstream culture. That shared experience of subjective truth is the world that Tarantino envisions, wherein what was his past experience becomes the new mainstream pop culture. His referencing of the past alters the present mindset of what the past is. He even took it so far to the point that he then takes his own work to recontextualize it against itself. It's the highest form of self-awareness, an intense take on postmodern filmmaking, disrupting the hierarchical forms by taking the crass and recontextualizing it to the highest echelons that art can achieve. Hence why there are multiple existing realities within his films. His characters are caricatures of other characters in his work. Characters share names, and Tarantino's aware of this, with possibly the most well-done artistic breakdown of this form being done in the Brazilian short film Tarantino's Mind.
No Cães de Aluguel, cada assaltante tem apelido. O nome verdadeiro do Mr. Blonde é Vic Vega. Ele é irmão do Vincent Vega, que é o John Travolta no Pulp Fiction.
Vic Vega's outside. Hold on. Oh, Vic Vega.
Vincent Vega.
If we look back to the Beatles and their cover of Sgt. Pepper, we see an artist's awareness of their iconic status and the playing with that. But when we look toward the Beastie Boys, we see another group who grew up within that, taking that art and manipulating it in a way that would seem almost sacrosanct to do. Not changing the artist's original message, but showing how it was filtered through an audience perspective. The same with Tarantino. Artists like Godard and Scorsese showed that self-awareness became an important thing in creating the individuality of an auteur. But Tarantino was able to display that there was just as much merit in grabbing what had already been done and showing how he interpreted it. Tarantino built upon what artists like Godard and Scorsese had built before him, the same way that the Beastie Boys built upon what the Beatles did before them. When Frank Zappa took his turn to recontextualize Sgt. Pepper's cover as a response to what he believed to be the Beatles' redundancy, he was making a new and unique point. It would be superfluous to then reference Zappa's already referential work. The point had been made. Tarantino makes referential cinema, a way of looking at the cinema of the past through a completely unique perspective, which was surprisingly to take what existed and not change it. It's harder to see now, as Tarantino's idea of recontextualizing culture was so effective that his cinema became a sort of hyper-reality within itself. But we must not forget just how important Tarantino has been to the story of cinema. The reason Pulp Fiction won the Palme d'Or is because that had truly never been seen before in cinema. Yes, Meshes of the Afternoon made popular non-linearity, Nouvelle Vague was characterised by the playing of cinematic elements, and the golden age of Japanese cinema was well adversed in fusing genres together. However, we hadn't yet seen an awareness of this culture of cinema to look at it with fresh eyes. There will be many that deem Tarantino's process as damaging to art, and there is validity in this. When making art, it's not my personal approach to consciously take from others. However, I'm also aware that right now, I'm taking someone's work and siphoning it through my own perspective. Bad artists copy, and good artists steal. We live in a very postmodern age, and there is strong value in taking what already exists and making it your own. However, if the point has been done before you, it has to be left alone, before everything becomes a copy of a Xerox. And wouldn't it have been much worse that instead of copying and pasting from other work, that they were subtly changed, as if pretending that they weren't direct influences? Tarantino may steal, but at least he stole in an interesting way.